Bueno, entonces a continuación vamos a recibir a Génesis Andrade, estudiante de cuarto año del programa de licenciatura en Lengua y Literatura Inglesa en la Universidad de Chile y quien se encuentra actualmente cursando el seminario de grado de literatura romántica dictado por el profesor Andrés Ferrada, y nos va a presentar su ponencia de Montagues The Capulets, Two Partitions United in a Feud. La recibimos con un gran aplauso.
Well, thank you for your presentation. First of all, good day. Thank you all for being here today. Today I'm presenting a work that I worked on last year with Professor Ferrada, and it is called The Montagues and the Capulets, Two Partitions United in a Feud. Union in partition is an image recurrently used by Shakespeare in his works, and Romeo and Juliet is in no less degree a tragedy in which this image is faithfully manifested in a different way, though as represented originally in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Thank you. Where this image accounts for the nature of the individual as being understood and recognized in terms of their united partition. Similarly, but not exactly, in the tragedy, union in partition works at a different level, since it does not embody an individuality in crisis, but a society in crisis. Verona society is divided up into two institutions, the Montagues and the Capulets. But at the same time, these are united by the bond of feud, which gives rise to a new vision of the families and a tragic vision to the whole play. As mentioned previously then, the play from which this image is derived is called A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is necessary then to briefly contextualize its appearance. Union in partition can be regarded as an image that authentically materializes the notion of intersubjectivity. Not of any kind, but one that emphasizes the idea of a crisis. Its first appearance is made through a speech at the voice of Helena, when she thought her best friend Hermia had played a dreadful joke on her. The young Helena, sunk into a state of total disappointment and confusion, expresses that her friendship with Hermia has always been as a union in partition. At this point, imagery plays an important part. One of the most prevalent images in her speech is the double cherry, for it portrays the fact that despite of being two people, their friendship is the feeling that connects each partition and transforms them into a perfect unity. Union in partition as a present image in Romeo and Juliet is analyzed along the lines of the very beginning of the play, including the prologue and a few speeches from Act 1, Scene 1. These passages establish the foreground, which helps the audience to read the play, focusing on the interaction of these two partitions and the new tragic conception which is made by their combination. The prologue also, as it anticipates a socially convulsed atmosphere, functions as a means by which the audience can suppose how this union is going to end. In this tragedy, the image of a union in partition represents a society in crisis. Therefore, it cements the tragic nature of this play, which has its climax when the martyrs, Romeo and Juliet, encounter death. In the first scene of Act 1 and its prologue, this image is clearly observed, and it constitutes the environment for the subsequent tragic events. The division of Verona society reflects a state of profound crisis, which is the perfect scenario for setting the tragedy. As Coppelia reveals in her Coming of Age in Verona, quote, "The Montagues and the Capulets make weak gestures towards civil peace, while participating emotionally in the feud as much as their children do. These two important families united in enmity feel so much hatred against each other that they do not even care about the warning of Prince Scalus. He proposes death penalty to anyone who dares to act violently against each other and threatens civil peace. Considering this as a constant atmosphere, The hatred expands from the head of the houses to servants, from parents to children, and they all engage in a common activity which is formed by the feud as union, that of being in opposition to the other. Taking these ideas into account, the ruler of Verona, Prince Scalus, can be portrayed in the light of a symbolic meaning. As the leader of a society, the prince represents law and justice. The symbol of a scale can be linked to the prince's name, Scalus, the balance scale, which accounts for the idea of measure, for a state of equilibrium between these two opposing institutions. This character, by consequence, is represented by means of a symbolic scale and acts as a reminder of balance. However, the carelessness with which some members of each family receive the warning about capital punishment does also establish a balance, not in the plot, but in the tragic nature of the play. For without going against the rules, the tragedy would be neither possible nor the facilitator of a chain of disastrous events. Thus, the balance scale works at the level of the literary form in this case. Following the discussion of the image at question, neither the prince nor Friar Lawrence can be a real threat to this union in partition. It is an integral whole strengthened by the feeling of hatred. In a formal dwelling written by James Calderwood, it is recognized that the friar tries to bring back together the opponent families when marrying the lovers in secret, but it results in a useless attempt to unite the opposite partitions into peace. The author is right when he calls it, quote, an ideal union, since the marriage does not have an actual force capable of transforming the feud into a peaceful bond. Although a constructive end is directed by the restorative function of tragedies, in the meanwhile it seems that nothing can come up for good. The prince's warning and the friar's plan are not enough to transform the tragic events in the play. Neither civil authority nor religion achieve the purpose of giving a change of direction to this tragedy. As Susan Snyder in her Comedy into Tragedy recognizes, quote, the events of tragedy acquire urgency in their uniqueness and their irrevocability. End of the quote. They are all meant to be inevitable actions responsible for the misfortunes along the play. In case that these ideas intended to destroy the union in partition as a feud and replace it by a peaceful tie, it would be no tragedy at all. Quote, tragedy has been compared to ritual sacrifice. She says, in the sense that the young protagonists end up sacrificing their own lives to eradicate the feud and configure a union of peace instead. Only the tragic and fated death could pay the price for the destruction of their enmity between the partitions. As the foundations had been laid, then, the aim of this paper is to identify the traces of the image of a union in partition as established since the very beginning of the play, and also to give a proposal for analysis in which this image can be considered as central axis in the understanding of Romeo and Juliet. First of all, in the opening verses of the prologue to Act 1, the idea of a quarrel begins to be established and remains being a constant theme for this tragedy. Quote, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene from ancient grudge, break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. End of the quote. As it is noticeable, the first verses give immediately a hint of what the audience is about to encounter. They prepare the audience for the possibility of configuring an image introduced by two partitions, institutions, or households, which are understood in combination by being part of a grudge. The immediate identity that is attributed to these two families together is that of an ancient hostility. In other words, the two institutions in continuous dispute are somehow the images that account for the communal conflict or for the society in crisis, where a feud is the main setting and where enmity is the cause for making citizens' hands impure, as the prologue stated, and by killing other citizens, of course. From now on, each family as institution is identified in terms of the other, of being in dispute with the other. The one or the other in isolation would not give rise to such a passionate grudge. For if the Capulets would not exist, who would have played the Montagues counterpart, or vice versa? There would be no feud at all, and in the absence of one partition. In the parent's rage, which is actually a synecdoche for the institution's rage, the force of the feud is fairly promoted with great scope. For in Scene 1 of Act 1, the servants to Capulet demonstrate their anger against the Montagues. Both servants and masters profess the hatred by equal manners. Gregory explicitly acknowledges so in his conversation with Samson. Quote, "The quarrel is between our masters and us. They are men." The feeling of membership permits the servants to be part of the institution, and the obligation of honoring it falls over them. Therefore, they are also part of the confrontation with the opposite side. Following the same lines, the servants to Capulet, Gregory and Samson, start a fight at the moment they saw two servants to Montague, Abram and Balthazar. The scene opens with the verbal materialization of the hatred between the partitions. But surprisingly soon it takes form of action, and representative members from the two bands engage in a fight. Once started this fight, Benvolio, who is part of the Montagues, tries to intervene and stop the quarrel, but again in a vain attempt which ends up with him engaging in the fight with Tybalt also. That is part of the Capulets. Benvolio, when being challenged to a fight by Tybalt, expresses his peaceful desire. Quote, "I do but keep the peace. Put up thy sword." End of the quote. However, to maintain the peace runs contrary to a tragedy, for the crisis must be imposed by quarreling. The hot-blooded Tybalt responds, leaving his deep enmity and reputation revealed. Quote, "As I hate hell, all Montagues, and thee, have at thee, coward." End of the quote. And at this moment there is no other option but to fight and defend the honor of their respective institutions, as making also their union of hatred more solidified by fighting. As it is observable, the fight starts with servants and then it goes up to some direct blood relatives, Benvolio and Tybalt. Actually, the feud continues going up and making the union stronger when Capulet and Montague themselves appear in the scene ready to take active part into the fight and to show each other profound demonstrations of loathing. First, Capulet exposes his anger by asking for his sword. Quote, "My sword, I said, all Montague is come, and flourishes his blade in spite of me." End of the quote. There is only one thing he needs to make his hatred against Montague visible: his sword as a tool to defend his name and eradicate his foe. Montague also feels quite enthusiastic to quarrel with his enemy. Quote, "Thou villain Capulet, hold me not, let me go." End of the quote. He does not want anything to intervene in his fight with Capulet, except the two feelings of hatred which compose the society in crisis. The rising of fights between men from different social levels makes clear the central feature of these two families. They both are united in a feud that is vainly threatened by the prince's desire to re-establish civil peace in Verona. The friar's plan of the secret wedding, or Benvolio's want for peace. The only event that is actually capable of transforming this union in partition governed by hatred into one that is governed by peace, is a purely tragic event, the death of Romeo and Juliet. The prologue concludes, quote, "A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Home is adventure, pitches, overthrows. Do with their death bury their parents' strife, stating that they die as martyrs for their family's quarrel, and abruptly change the direction of this union. Their deaths serve as a mechanism to transform the union in feud into a union in peace, being the goal status, the materialization of the feud, and the representation of a new peaceful beginning. It would be curious to think then that if Romeo and Juliet had a sequel, this would not be a tragedy per se, for its tragic nature was lost at the very moment when the institution accepted to be united by a peaceful bond, and understood the dead youth as the sacrifice that closed the dispute. Quote, "Poor sacrifices over enmity," end of the quote, are the final words of a Capulet who is aware of the tragic and their feud led to, and willing to make amends. As some final words on the subject, union and partition plays a fundamental role in Romeo and Juliet, for it develops one of the most important themes of this tragedy. This dispute between two institutions, which is inevitably associated to a society in crisis, a society which is divided and threatened by the confluence of two forces or partitions. The tragic elements of this play are basically consequences of the prevalence of this image, which imposes negativity, and the setting of a social crisis in Verona. The scope of the feud is so wide that most of the characters play a role within a particular institution or partition and automatically become fused with the opposite one. The heads of the households, kinmen, and servants all engage in feud. Even the youth, by falling in love, unleash the supernatural force of this union and become its martyrs. Finally, to end this presentation, it is worth to say that this proposal for analysis is open to further research, of course. It would be interesting to examine the interaction of the partitions in union along the play, and their transition to a more pacific connection, and to determine the sphere that plays a major role in the growth of a tragic perspective, whether the social or the individual, for instance, together with many other scenes that surely play a significant role in one of the most outstanding tragedies written by Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, ahora dejamos el espacio por algunas preguntas o comentarios que alguien tenga.